John D'Agostino is known as the Ivy League kid who changed the world of oil through his role in creating the Dubai Mercantile Exchange. Today, he is part of DMS Governance, a New York-based professional fund governance firm. We talked to him about whether shareholders these days are in a better place, wealth disparity, and whether he was really followed by the CIA. Has the disparity gone way too far? Have the have and have not really just been so broad that they can elect somebody like Donald Trump, who's controversial, to say the least, you know? So is that why, that's why does capitalism need to change to sort of like acknowledge that the haves have just have too much?
I don't know if that election is a barometer of anything, because it was the have-nots that largely elected Donald Trump. And I think it's a little bit arrogant to say we don't like that decision they made and therefore we need to adjust the system. But I think you need to listen to what's happening, and regardless of whether or not fewer people living below poverty, regardless of whether or not the average low-income individual lives a better life than they would have 25, 50, or 100 years ago. The reality is people view themselves both in an absolute basis and a relative basis. So even though they may be doing slightly better, if they see the spread between where they are and where others are widen, and then more importantly, if they see the mechanism to get there disappear, and that's really what it is. It's not really about the Gini coefficient. It's not really about the absolute. It's more about the absolute level of poverty, and then also the loss of hope and the loss of social advancement. And there's certainly evidence that it's become harder than it has in prior generations to move out of a certain economic status. In the U.S. and in Europe, I'm not as familiar with the case in Asia, but I'm assuming if it's happening, the rest of the world is happening here. And that loss of hope and that loss of mobility is what's really going to drive the dissatisfaction with current systems.
Who you represent is DMS. You guys are present on a lot of boards, all over, and you represent sort of like the shareholder interests, right?
That's right.
As
the independent director, we represent the shareholders. You
represent the shareholder interests. So it's interesting for me to draw parallels that back here in Malaysia, we're actually seeing more of that. We are seeing sort of, represent. So what lessons, I mean, from your experience doing DMS, has the individual shareholder gotten a bigger voice? I mean, like, how do you make sure that they do get a bigger voice and they do not get squeezed out?
I do think overall shareholders have gotten a larger voice. I think the ability to publicize corporate actions that are being taken against them, pro or con, good governance is transparency. They're inseparable. So I think one of the things that we have with social media is the ability to publicize things where individuals can have the potential reach of news organizations.
What other measures do you think could actually make sure that individual shareholders sort of like represent and fight back a bit more? What more can be done? That's what I want to know.
Self-servingly, I would say representation. Having representation at the board level, where they can take action and they can monitor, is extremely important. A typical company, and we represent mostly private funds, but a typical, there's various members of the ecosystem. There's auditors, accountants, administrators, whose job it is to kind of make sure that the entity is acting in the way it's supposed to act. So it has a fund has a valuation policy. The auditor and the administrator ensure that the portfolio is valued in accordance with the valuation policy, as well as regional accounting standards. The law firm makes sure the firm is behaving in accordance with local and international laws. But the only member of that ecosystem whose sole reason for living is to protect the individual shareholder and who has a direct fiduciary responsibility is the independent director. And they're the only one amongst that board who's not conflicted by being a member of management. So I do think having independent directors that are informed about the business of the company or the fund is the best way to ensure that all shareholders, remember, and as a representative, we represent all shareholders, not just the common, not just the preferred, not just the earlier or later, all shareholders. And because companies and their share registrars can get quite complex, with different share classes having different rights and privileges, an action the company takes will not necessarily treat everyone equally, but our job is to make sure it treats everybody fairly.
Does legal mandate help? Let's say if I have a board of 10, legal mandate says that a third of it has to be independent, 2/3 of it has to be women. Does that help at all? Because that's what's happening here. They are making sure there are more women in boards.
I'm a free marketer, so I would hope that the market would come to that decision on its own, but it clearly hasn't. So I'm also a believer that sometimes people need a good kick in the butt, and if that regulation is going to inspire that, I think that's a good thing.
You were the subject of this book called Rigged, which you've told me you don't actually like the title of.
I don't like the title. I like the book, not the title.
Yeah, okay. You like the book, not the title.
Yeah.
Basically, the kid who funded the Dubai Mercantile Exchange, that's your thing about it. I mean, like,
kid.
Yeah, well, that's the exact title, isn't it?
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So how did that actually come about? I mean, like, because you did mention that you think that part of it is luck. It is luck that you did, but it's sort of work
mostly
as well.
Luck. It's
yeah.
mostly
So
luck.
how did that come about?
The way the book came about is I was able to find myself in the right place at the right time at the New York Mercantile Exchange to be tasked with the building out of the Dubai Mercantile Exchange, which was the first derivatives exchange trading crude oil in the Middle East. And that sounds boring, but it's really actually amazing, because if we look at, especially look at what's been happening with America and the Middle East over the last couple of decades, the notion of exporting Western capitalist democratic principles to use a free market to price crude oil in the heart of the Middle East is a wonderful notion. It's a wonderful example of those American ideals being exported in the right way and being done in partnership and being done to further growth. And I was really honored to be a part of that. So that project got some press, a few articles, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. Mr. Mesrick was on his second or third bestseller, and amazingly thought that my story could be interesting enough to be one of his fourth or fifth bestsellers.
Yeah, because he wrote The Accidental Billionaires, which went on to become The Social Network. Then where did the CIA agent come in? No, I asked this almost frivolously, but you did, the one part they did mention a CIA agent.
Ben would support, the writer would support. He has a style called narrative nonfiction, where he takes certain real events and maybe dramatizes them for the purposes of making the book interesting. So the CIA was a part of it. When I was one time during one of my trips in Dubai, there was an incident where my computer was potentially looked at, and I wasn't sure if it was in Dubai. It might have been one of the other countries we were visiting. But we had an issue with my computer; it was compromised. So I did spend some time with the CIA examining my computer, and I think that became the
agent
shadowy CIA agent following me around. So that's good for literature, maybe good for the movie version. But the reality was, anytime you go do work, especially on an economically important project in a different part of the world, government agencies kind of want to know what you're doing and want to be involved. But I would say everybody on the U.S. side was incredibly supportive of this notion, because again, what better way to signify partnership between the U.S. and the Middle East than to work together on a capitalist mechanism like an exchange. So I think there was a lot of excitement, interest. There's always a little bit of concern, but that's where the CIA
agent came from.